The diner on Clearwater Avenue had been open since 1987. It had survived 3 recessions, 2 floods, 1 fire that took out the back kitchen and half the roof, a pandemic that closed it for 14 months, and the particular slow death of a neighborhood that used to be something and was in the process of becoming something else again. It had survived all of these things because of one reason, which was that the food was good and the coffee was strong and the man behind the counter remembered your name. His name was Frank Delano. He was 63 years old, medium height, wide shoulders that had narrowed slightly with age, gray hair that had once been black, and the kind of face that had accumulated its years honestly. Lines where there should be lines, weight where time had put it, and eyes that were still, even now, alert in a way that made people feel seen when he looked at them. Frank had bought the diner from its original owner, a Greek man named Petros, in 1994 for a sum of money that had taken him 9 years to save, and which had left him with $11 in his bank account on the day he signed the papers. He had spent the first 2 years making mistakes and learning from them, the next 10 years building something real, and the 20 years after that maintaining what he had built with the particular patience of someone who understood that a good thing required daily attention to stay good. He was behind the counter at 6 in the morning every day except Sunday. He had been behind the counter at 6 in the morning every day except Sunday for 29 years. The thing people noticed about Frank, the thing that was not obvious at first but that became obvious over time, was the notebook. It was a standard black composition notebook, the kind that cost 99 cents at any drugstore, and Frank kept one in his apron pocket at all times. He had kept one in his apron pocket since 1996, the year he had made a decision that he had never explained to anyone, and that had changed, without his planning or intending it, the lives of more people than he could count. The decision was this: he was going to remember people, not just their names and their orders, though he remembered those too. He was going to remember the things they mentioned in passing, the things people said when they were not really talking to you, when they were just filling silence the way people fill silence in diners, with the small facts of their lives. My daughter's got a dance recital Thursday. I've been trying to find a good mechanic ever since Terry's closed down. My mom's in the hospital again, same thing as last year. I've been sending out resumes for 3 months and nothing. Frank wrote these things down. Not in front of people. He was not a man who made his attentiveness visible, because visible attentiveness was a performance and Frank had no interest in performing. He wrote them down later, during the slow hour between breakfast and lunch when the diner went quiet and he had time to think. He kept a notebook for names and a different section for what he called particulars. Particulars were the things that mattered to people. Particulars were what made a person rather than a customer. When a woman named Carol Briggs mentioned in October that her son was applying to colleges, and she was worried about the application fees, Frank did not say anything sympathetic in the moment. He just nodded and refilled her coffee. But 3 weeks later, when he happened to overhear a conversation between 2 men at the counter about a community foundation that helped with college application costs for families that qualified, he wrote the foundation's name in the notebook, and on Carol's next visit, he mentioned it the way you mention something you just happen to think of, conversationally, as if it were nothing. Carol's son applied. He was accepted to his first-choice school. She brought Frank a piece of the graduation cake 3 years later, carried it in a Tupperware container on the bus, and cried a little when she put it on the counter, and he pretended not to notice. That was how Frank worked. He did not announce what he was doing. He did not keep a tally. He did not think of it as charity or community service or any of the words people used for doing things for other people. He thought of it as paying attention. And paying attention, he had come to believe, was the most powerful thing one human being could offer another. The morning this story properly begins was a Tuesday in March. The breakfast rush had come and gone, and Frank was wiping down the counter when the door opened, and a woman came in that he had never seen before. She was in her mid-30s, thin in the way that suggested she was not thin by choice, wearing a jacket that was too light for March, and carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder that appeared to contain a laptop and several folders that were held together with a rubber band. Her hair was pulled back, and she had the expression of someone who had been managing something difficult for long enough that managing difficult things had become her resting state. She sat at the counter. Frank put a coffee in front of her before she asked, because it was 6:45 in the morning, and she looked like someone who needed coffee more than she needed to be asked if she wanted some. "Thank you," she said. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Cold out," Frank said. "Very," she said. She opened the laptop and looked at whatever was on the screen for a moment, then closed it again. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the window. She looked like someone trying to decide which problem to address first in a day that contained too many. "You want something to eat?" Frank asked. She glanced at the menu on the wall, then back at her bag. "Just the coffee for now," she said. The way she said it, Frank noted, was the way people said it when they were trying to make coffee stretch. "Eggs and toast comes with the coffee special," Frank said. "Tuesday special, $4 total." This was not true. There was no Tuesday special. But Frank had been inventing specials for 29 years and he had gotten good at it. She looked at him. "Really? Tuesday," he said, as if this explained everything, and turned to start the eggs. Her name he found out over the next 20 minutes, not by asking directly, but by the way conversation worked when someone was tired and caffeinated, and the diner was quiet, and the man across the counter seemed genuinely interested. Was Nora Voss. She was a social worker. She had been a social worker for 11 years. She worked for a nonprofit called Cornerstone that provided transitional housing support to families coming out of the shelter system. She covered a caseload of 43 families, which was significantly more than the recommended maximum of 28, because Cornerstone had lost 2 staff members in the previous 6 months and had not yet replaced them. She lived in an apartment 7 blocks from the diner. She had discovered the diner that morning because her usual coffee place had a broken espresso machine, and she had walked further than planned. She had been awake since 4:30 because one of her families, a mother with 2 small children who had just moved into a transitional housing unit on Maple Street, had called her about a leak in the ceiling that the landlord was refusing to address. And Nora had spent 2 hours on the phone trying to reach someone who could help, before giving up and deciding to go to the office early to find the right contact number, which she was certain was somewhere in her files if she could just find it. Frank listened to all of this. He refilled her coffee twice. He did not offer advice or sympathy because Nora was not talking in a way that requested either. She was talking the way very tired people sometimes talked, emptying things out a little, making space. When she left, eating all the eggs and half the toast, and leaving a $5 bill on the counter even though Frank had said 4, she said, "This was a good find. I'll probably be back." "I'll be here," Frank said, which was true. He was always here. After she left, he took the notebook from his apron pocket. Nora Voss, social worker, Cornerstone nonprofit, transitional housing, caseload too high, 43 families. Needs landlord contact for Maple Street unit, ceiling leak. Mom with 2 kids. He underlined the Maple Street part. Frank knew a man named Gil Torres who had spent 30 years as a housing inspector for the city before he retired. Gil came in for breakfast every Wednesday. He knew every landlord in the city by name, and he knew, more importantly, which ones would respond to a call from someone who knew their history with the inspection department, and which ones needed a stronger approach. Frank wrote Gil's name beside the underline. He closed the notebook and went back to wiping the counter. Nora came back on Thursday. She looked slightly less exhausted, which Frank noted without commenting on. "Did the ceiling situation get resolved?" he asked, putting her coffee down. She looked up. "How did you? I mentioned that." "Tuesday," he said. She thought about it for a moment. "I did, didn't I? You actually remembered that." "I remember things," Frank said. "It's not resolved yet," she said. "I've been trying to get someone from the city on the phone, but the numbers I have are all wrong. Whoever updated our database did it wrong, and half the contacts in the housing enforcement section are outdated." Frank nodded. He refilled her coffee. The next morning, he mentioned to Gil Torres, as Gil was finishing his second cup and his usual Western omelet, that he had a question about who handled housing enforcement complaints for rental properties on Maple Street. Gil, who enjoyed nothing more than an excuse to deploy 30 years of institutional knowledge, spent 12 minutes explaining exactly who the right person was, what their direct number was, and what specific language produced the fastest response. Frank wrote it all in the notebook. On Saturday, when Nora came in, she had been coming in every morning now, the diner having apparently cemented itself into her routine. Frank put her coffee in front of her, and then, in the way he mentioned things, said, "I happen to hear something that might be useful for the Maple Street situation." He wrote the name and number on a napkin and slid it across the counter. Nora looked at the napkin, then at Frank. "Where did this come from?" "I know a lot of people," Frank said. 30 years in the same place, you accumulate. She called the number from the diner, standing at the end of the counter near the window while Frank served the breakfast rush. He watched her expression change as she spoke, the particular change that happened when someone who had been hitting walls finally found a door. The inspector visited the Maple Street property the following Tuesday. The landlord received a formal notice. The ceiling was repaired by Friday. Nora brought Frank a piece of cornbread that she had made herself on Sunday morning, carried in a paper bag, and put it on the counter without saying anything about what it was for. Because it was not payment, and it was not thank you exactly. It was just a person who had been given something deciding to give something back. Frank ate the cornbread and wrote nothing in the notebook about it, because some things did not need to be recorded. The notebook had been started because of a man named Raymond. Frank had never told anyone this. He was not sure he would have been able to explain it properly if he tried. But Raymond was the reason. Raymond Chu had been a regular at the diner in the mid-90s. A man in his 40s who worked at a printing company 2 blocks over and came in for lunch every weekday, and sometimes for breakfast on days when he had an early shift. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but not someone who said much beyond his order and occasional comments about the weather. For about 8 months, Raymond had been coming in less often. Then, gradually, not at all. Frank had noticed but had not thought much of it. People's routines changed. They moved, they changed jobs, they found different places to eat. 2 years later, Frank ran into Raymond's wife at the hardware store. She told him that Raymond had died. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed and gone in 7 months. Frank said how sorry he was and meant it. Walking home, he thought about Raymond. He thought about all the times Raymond had sat at the counter and mentioned things in the way quiet people mentioned things, briefly, without emphasis. He thought about a Tuesday in late spring when Raymond had said, almost to himself, that he had been having bad stomach pain for 2 months and couldn't figure out if it was something he was eating. He thought about how Frank had nodded and said something like could be a lot of things and moved on to the next customer. He thought about how he had not remembered that until now. He thought about whether it would have mattered if he had. Whether if he had said that long, "Have you seen a doctor?" Whether that would have made any difference at all. Probably not. Probably it was already too late by then or would have been regardless. He did not know. He would never know. But he thought about Raymond on and off for months after that conversation at the hardware store. He thought about the small things people said that nobody registered. He thought about how much information passed through a diner every single morning, how many people mentioned things that mattered, and how completely those things disappeared into the general noise. He had started the notebook 6 weeks after running into Raymond's wife. He could not save Raymond. He could not change what had happened. But he could decide, going forward, to actually listen, to treat the things people mentioned as real, to hold on to them, to do something with them when he could. That was all. He did not think it was a grand gesture. He did not think of himself as a good person in any particular way. He just thought that if you spent your life in a place where people came every morning, the least you could do was be actually present while they were there. The spring that Nora became a regular, 3 other things happened at the diner that Frank recorded in the notebook. A man named Derek Walsh, who drove a delivery truck and came in for coffee at 7:15 every morning, mentioned in the first week of April that his teenage daughter had stopped going to school, and he did not know what to do about it, and his wife was at her wit's end, and the school counselor had suggested therapy, but the insurance situation was complicated. Frank wrote it down. A week later, a woman named Patricia Osai, who worked at the hospital 3 blocks over and had been coming in for breakfast twice a week for 4 years, mentioned that she had just started volunteering at a free mental health clinic on Saturday mornings that specifically served adolescents on a sliding scale basis. No insurance required. Frank mentioned Patricia's clinic to Derek the following Wednesday, casually, in the way he mentioned things. Derek's daughter started at the clinic in May. By July, she was back in school part-time. Derek told Frank this standing at the counter one morning with his coffee, not making a big thing of it, because Derek was not a man who made big things of situations. He just said, "She's doing better," and Frank said, "Good," and Derek nodded, and that was that. The second thing was a woman named Margie Fontaine, 74 years old, retired school teacher, who came in on weekday mornings and had been coming in for 6 years. Margie had mentioned in February that her furnace had gone out, and the repair estimate was more than she could manage on her fixed income, and she had been sleeping in her coat at night, which she mentioned with the rueful practicality of someone who had learned to report hardship without complaint. Frank had written this down in February. He had spent 3 weeks asking careful questions, not of Margie, who he did not want to embarrass, but of the various people who came through the diner who might know about assistance programs for elderly homeowners. He found out about a county program through a woman who worked at the county clerk's office. He found out the eligibility requirements. He found out the phone number and the name of the specific person who handled applications. He gave all of this to Margie in March, on a folded piece of paper, again presented in the way he presented things, not as a formal act of help, but as a thing he had come across that might be useful. Margie had the furnace repaired by mid-April through the county program. She brought Frank a coffee cake she had made herself, which he ate over 3 mornings, and which was, he thought, one of the better coffee cakes he had ever had. The third thing was a man named James Cooper, early 40s, new to the neighborhood, who had started coming in late March. James was a contractor who had recently started his own small business after years of working for a larger firm. He was quiet and competent-seeming, and in the first week mentioned, in the context of explaining why he was new to the neighborhood, that he had moved here from the east side of the city because he had needed a fresh start after a divorce that had cost him more or less everything. Frank wrote this down not because he had an immediate solution or connection, but because he was paying attention. James came in every day. Over the following weeks, Frank learned, in the accumulation of small conversations, that James had the skills and the work ethic, but was struggling to find clients because he was starting from zero in a new part of the city and did not know anyone, and word of mouth, which was how contracting work lived or died, required a mouth to start. By the time Nora Voss had been coming to the diner for 6 months, she had figured out something about Frank Delano that most people took much longer to notice, if they noticed it at all. She had figured it out because her job was paying attention to people, and she was good at her job. She came in one Thursday morning in September, sat at her usual spot at the counter, and waited until the rush had thinned out before she said, "Can I ask you something?" Frank put her coffee in front of her. "You can ask," he said. "The thing you do," she said, "where you mention things, where you happen to know something that happens to be exactly what someone needed. How long have you been doing that?" Frank looked at her for a moment. "What makes you think I do anything in particular?" "I'm a social worker," Nora said. "I notice things too." Frank dried a cup. He considered, as he did sometimes with people he trusted, how much to say. 27 years, he said. Nora was quiet for a moment. "Since when?" "Since 1996. "What happened in 1996? Frank told her about Raymond. He had not told anyone about Raymond before. He told her the short version, the diagnosis, the running into the wife, the conversation about stomach pain he had not paid attention to. He told it without drama, in the same register he used to describe everything, because that was the only register he had. Nora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "And you've been keeping a notebook since then," she said. "Yes." "How many notebooks?" Frank thought. 63, maybe 64, I count sometimes. Nora looked at him for a long moment. "Do you know how many people you've helped?" "No," Frank said. "I don't keep track of that." "Why not?" "Because it's not the point," Frank said. "If I kept track of that, I'd be doing it for myself." Nora was quiet again. "The point," Frank said, "is just that when someone comes in and tells me something, I hear it. That's all. Most people aren't heard. That seems wrong to me." "That's it," Nora said. "That's it," Frank said. She looked at her coffee for a moment. "I've been a social worker for 11 years, she said, "and I want to tell you that what you're describing is not small. What you're describing is how things actually change. Not through programs or systems or funding, those matter, but they're not how things change at the human level. Things change at the human level because someone pays attention." Frank said nothing. He was not comfortable receiving descriptions of himself. "I'm going to keep coming here," Nora said. "I figured," Frank said. He refilled her coffee. That fall, a boy named Marcus started coming to the diner. He was 16 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of guarded expression that Frank had learned over 29 years to recognize as the expression of someone who had been let down by enough adults that letting an adult in felt more dangerous than keeping them out. Marcus came in after school, around 3:30, and ordered whatever was cheapest on the menu and nursed it for as long as he reasonably could. Frank knew this pattern. He had seen it many times. It was the pattern of someone who needed to be somewhere that was not wherever he was coming from. Frank did not push. He kept the coffee warm. He did not ask questions Marcus had not offered to answer. Over 3 weeks, the following came out in pieces, in the way things came out when someone was testing whether a place was safe enough to be honest in. Marcus lived with his grandmother on the south side. His mother had left when he was 8, and his father had been incarcerated since Marcus was 11. His grandmother was 71 and had bad knees and worked part-time at a laundry to supplement her social security. Marcus was doing well in school. This came out reluctantly, as if it might be something to be embarrassed about, particularly in math, and in a computer class he had started taking that year. He wanted, when pressed with a question from Frank that was gentle enough not to feel like pressing, to study computer science. But college was something that existed in the abstract, the way people described things they had been told they could aspire to, without being given any of the specific information about how aspiring actually worked. Frank wrote all of it down. He also wrote down that Marcus had mentioned his computer teacher, a man named Mr. Aldous, as the one person at school who had told him clearly and specifically that he was good at this. The following week, a man named David Park sat at the counter for lunch. David was a software engineer who came in occasionally when he was working from a co-working space nearby. He had come in half a dozen times over the past 2 years, and Frank knew that he worked at a mid-sized tech company that had a summer internship program, and that he occasionally mentioned feeling that the company did not do enough to reach students from schools that weren't already plugged into the tech pipeline. Frank mentioned Marcus to David the way he mentioned things. He said he had a kid who came in after school, sharp, interested in computer science, good student, didn't have the network that would normally connect someone like that to someone like David. David looked at him for a moment. "How old?" 16, Frank said. "Junior. Has he done any coding?" "I don't know specifically," Frank said. "His teacher apparently thinks he's talented." David was quiet for a moment. "Tell him to come by the co-working space. I'll talk to him. No promises, but I'll talk to him." Frank mentioned this to Marcus the following Tuesday in the way he mentioned things, which was to say without any weight on it, because weight made things feel like charity and charity made people feel small. Marcus went to the co-working space the following Thursday. He came back to the diner on Friday looking like someone who had been shown a door he had not known existed. "He talked to me for like an hour," Marcus said. "Yeah," Frank said. "He said I should apply for this program, a pre-internship thing they do for high schoolers. He said he'd put my name forward." "Sounds good," Frank said. "Why did you do that?" Marcus said. He was watching Frank with the particular attention of someone trying to figure out if a thing was real before they allowed themselves to believe it. "You mentioned you were interested in computers," Frank said. "I happen to know someone in that field. Seemed like the obvious thing." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "That's not why," he said. Frank looked back at him. "No. Nobody just does the obvious thing," Marcus said. "Not for someone like me." Frank thought about how to answer that. He thought about Raymond, which was where he always started when he tried to understand why he did what he did. He thought about 63 composition notebooks. He thought about all the people who had sat where Marcus was sitting and said things they assumed disappeared into the air. "I pay attention," Frank said finally. "That's all I can tell you. I pay attention, and when I can do something useful with what I've heard, I do it. You're not a special case. You're just a person who came in and told me things." Marcus was quiet for a while. "My grandma always says the only thing that costs nothing and means everything is attention," he said. "Your grandma is right," Frank said. Winter came to Clearwater Avenue the way winter always came, first as a threat and then as a fact. The diner got cold near the door and Frank put the space heater out, and the regulars shifted away from the window seats, and the soup became the most ordered item on the menu. Nora was in almost every morning now. Frank had stopped making up Tuesday specials because she had caught on and insisted on paying full price for everything, which he respected. So they had reached a compromise where she paid full price, and he made sure the portions were substantial. One morning in December, she sat down with her canvas bag and her laptop and her rubber-banded folders, and instead of opening any of them, she just looked at the counter. Frank put the coffee in front of her. He waited. "I have a family," she said after a moment. 47th family on my caseload. They've been on my list for 8 months. Mom, 3 kids, Dad is out of the picture. They've done everything right. They've been in the shelter system. They've been compliant. They've attended every program. They're exactly the family transitional housing is supposed to help. And they've been on the wait list for a transitional unit for 6 months, and I can't get them to the top of it because the system doesn't work that way. It's just length of time on the list, and I can't figure out how to help them, and I've been trying for 8 months, and I'm starting to feel like I'm useless." She said all of this very quickly, and then looked at her coffee. Frank did not say anything immediately. He knew the difference between someone who wanted advice and someone who needed to be heard first. After a moment, he said, "Tell me about the family." Nora looked up. "Why?" "Because then I'll know what I know," Frank said, so she told him. The mother's name was Angela. The 3 children were 7, 5, and 2. Angela had completed a job training program in medical billing and had a part-time position at a clinic, but needed stable housing before she could move to full-time, because full-time required consistent childcare, and consistent childcare required a stable address. She was caught in the specific trap that Nora described as the gap, the place where everything you needed to move forward required something you could not get without already having moved forward. Frank listened. He wrote nothing in front of Nora, but he was writing in his head, the way he had learned to write in his head during conversations so that he could transcribe accurately later. Angela, medical billing training, part-time at a clinic, needs stable housing for childcare for full-time. 3 kids, 7, 5, 2, 6 months on wait list. He thought. He went through, in his mind, the inventory of people who had sat at this counter over the past year and told him things. There was a woman named Helen Marsh, who had come in occasionally over the summer. Helen ran a small property management company and had mentioned, not prominently but Frank had heard it, that she was trying to diversify the portfolio of tenants in a set of units she managed on the north side, because she was tired of the transients and wanted more stable, long-term residents. He also thought about a man named Robert Acaffer who came in on Tuesdays and worked for a regional nonprofit that administered emergency housing grants. Robert had mentioned, in the context of a longer conversation about something else, that the grants were difficult to access for families already in the shelter system because the application required a fixed address for documentation, which shelter residents did not have. Frank thought about these 2 things together. He did not say anything to Nora that morning. He needed to talk to Helen first and to Robert, and he needed to do it in the right order. He talked to Helen the following Thursday. He talked to Robert the following Tuesday. On the Thursday after that, he mentioned to Nora, in the way he mentioned things, that he knew a property manager who was specifically looking for stable long-term tenants, and that there might be a way to approach the documentation problem for the grant application through a specific channel at the nonprofit. He wrote both names and the relevant details on a napkin. Nora looked at the napkin. She looked at Frank. She had been looking at Frank this way for several months now, with the expression of someone who kept expecting the thing to run out and kept being surprised when it didn't. "How do you do this?" she said. "I've been here a long time," Frank said. "A long time is a lot of people. A lot of people is a lot of things that can be connected." "You're connecting things," she said. "That's what you're doing. You're a human connector." Frank thought about this. "I don't know what that means exactly," he said. "It means you hold things," she said. "You hold what people tell you and you hold it until it connects to something else, and then you make the connection happen." Frank thought about this some more. It was not how he had ever described it to himself, but he supposed it was accurate. "Angela gets housed," he said. "I don't know yet," Nora said. "But this is the most real lead I've had in 8 months." She looked at the napkin. "I'm going to make these calls today." Angela and her 3 children moved into a stable unit in February. Nora told Frank on a Thursday morning, putting a small plant on the counter in front of him. A succulent in a terracotta pot, which she said was because she figured the diner needed more plants, and she did not know what else to bring. Frank put the plant on the windowsill behind the counter where the morning light hit it, and it was still there 3 years later.
Good morning, Sarah. Right on time. Frank.
Sorry, I overslept.
Not to worry. Let me get you your usual coffee.
The thing about Frank Delano that people eventually understood, if they stuck around long enough to understand it, was that what he did was not really about him. This was rarer than it sounded. Most things that people did for others, even genuinely good things, even things that made real differences, had some component of the self in them. The good feeling, the recognition, the story you got to tell about yourself. Frank had constructed his version of paying attention in a way that deliberately removed those things. Because he had understood early on that the moment you started thinking about what you were doing in the third person, the moment you started describing it as a thing you did, it stopped being actually about the other person and started being about your image of yourself as someone who helped people. He did not want an image of himself as someone who helped people. He wanted to actually help people. The difference was more significant than it sounded. This was what Nora had been trying to articulate on that September morning at the counter, and what she had come closer to understanding over the months since. Because Nora's entire professional life was structured around helping people, and she had spent 11 years navigating the gap between the structures designed to help and the actual experience of being helped. And she knew better than most people how much that gap could swallow. Frank's Diner was not a structure. It was not a system or a program or an institution. It was 63 cents coffee and strong eggs and a man who remembered what you said. And somehow, in the accumulated weight of 27 years of remembering, it had become something that the systems and programs and institutions could not quite replicate. In March of the following year, Marcus came back. He was 17 now, and he had grown another inch, and he carried himself differently. Not arrogantly, but with the specific change in posture that came from having been taken seriously by someone in a domain that mattered to you. He sat at the counter and Frank put coffee in front of him, though Marcus did not usually drink coffee, because Marcus was the kind of person who eventually became a coffee drinker, and Frank thought he might as well start now. Marcus looked at the coffee, he looked at Frank. "I got into the program," he said. "The pre-internship thing, I start in June." "Good," Frank said. "They said I was one of the strongest applicants," Marcus said. He said this carefully, like someone who was still checking whether the ground would hold. "That sounds right," Frank said. Marcus looked at him. "Mr. David, from the co-working space, he told me he almost didn't mention me to the program coordinator because he wasn't sure if I was ready. But he said you seemed sure." Frank said nothing to that. "Were you sure?" Marcus asked. Frank considered this honestly. "I thought you were capable," he said. "I didn't know what you were ready for. Nobody knows that ahead of time. But you vouched for me." "I mentioned you to someone," Frank said. "That's different." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Frank looked at him. "Because vouching for someone is about me. Mentioning someone is about them. I just said what I knew." What I knew was that you were smart and interested and working hard. The rest was up to you. Marcus thought about this for a long time, turning the coffee cup in his hands. My grandmother wants to meet you, he said finally. Frank smiled slightly. Tell her to come in Thursday morning, he said. I'll make her breakfast. Marcus's grandmother was a woman named Rosa Cooper. She was 71 years old, and she moved slowly because of her knees. But she moved with the bearing of someone who had been deciding to carry herself with dignity for so long that the dignity had become structural. She had silver hair and glasses on a chain, and she sat at the counter on a Thursday morning in April, and Frank put coffee and eggs and toast in front of her, and she looked at him for a long moment before she said anything. My grandson talks about you, she said. He's a good kid, Frank said. He is, Rosa said. He had a hard time of it for a while there. After his father went away, he closed down. She said this straightforwardly, with the matter-of-fact grief of someone who had processed the hardest things sufficiently to describe them plainly. He went quiet, and once a young man goes quiet in the way Marcus went quiet, you can lose him. Frank listened. Whatever you did, Rosa said, started him talking again. I didn't do much, Frank said. You listened to him, Rosa said. At his age, with his story, that was everything. Frank refilled her coffee. He thought about Raymond again, the way he always thought about Raymond when he was trying to understand why he did what he did. He thought about what it would have meant to Raymond to have someone actually hear him. He thought about whether Raymond had had anyone like that, and he thought he probably had not, because if Raymond had, he might have mentioned the stomach pain differently, with less dismissal, because people talked about things differently when they felt heard. He did not say any of this to Rosa. It was not her information. He's going to do well, Frank said instead. I know he is, Rosa said. She said it without sentimentality, as a fact she had simply decided was true. They ate breakfast together in the comfortable silence of two people who did not need to explain themselves to each other. In June, two things happened. The first was that Marcus started his pre-internship program and sent Frank a text. He had gotten Frank's number from Nora, who had gotten it at some point during the winter without Frank quite noticing. That said simply, Day 1, it's real. Frank read the text standing behind the counter during the slow hour between breakfast and lunch. He put the phone back in his apron pocket and went back to wiping the counter. The second thing was that a journalist came to the diner. Her name was Cara Ellis, and she worked for a regional magazine, and she had been tipped off, apparently, by someone in Nora's circle. Nora had told this to Frank with a combination of apology and interest, because she was not sure how Frank would feel about it, that there was a diner on Clearwater Avenue where something unusual had been happening for a long time. Cara came in on a Wednesday morning and sat at the counter and drank coffee and watched the diner for 2 hours before she said anything to Frank, which he appreciated. When the rush had thinned, she said, I've been hearing about you. Is that right? Frank said. People say you help them, she said. Not in the way you'd expect, not with money or direct services. They say you remember things and connect things and that it makes a difference. Frank looked at her carefully. She was in her early 30s and she had a notebook open on the counter, a black composition notebook, which Frank found briefly amusing. People say a lot of things, Frank said. Would you be willing to talk to me? She said. For an article. Frank was quiet for a moment. He thought about this. He had spent 27 years specifically not being the thing being noticed, because being the thing being noticed changed what the thing was. What would the article say? He said, I don't know yet, Cara said. I'd want to understand what you do and why you do it and how it works. What I do, Frank said, is run a diner. I make eggs, I keep the coffee hot. I try to pay attention to the people who come in. That's not all, Cara said. That's how it starts, Frank said. He thought about it for another moment. He thought about what Nora had said, that things changed at the human level because someone paid attention. He thought about whether an article could change that, could make it into something it wasn't, could turn paying attention into a brand or a strategy or a story someone told about themselves. He thought about Raymond. He thought about all the composition notebooks. He thought about Marcus's text, Day 1, it's real. I'll talk to you, he said, but not about me. I don't want to be the story. If there's a story, it's about the people who come in. It's about what happens when someone actually listens. That's the story. I'm just the place where it happened. Kara looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Tell me about the people. Frank put down the cloth he had been holding and leaned on the counter slightly. You want to know where it started? He said. Yes, she said. A man named Raymond, Frank said, and he told her. The article came out in September. It was not a long article. It was not on the cover. But it was honest, which was the only thing Frank had asked for, and it said what it needed to say, which was not that Frank Delano was a remarkable person, though it implied this without announcing it, but that a diner on Clearwater Avenue had become, over 27 years, a place where people were genuinely heard. And that being heard had changed things, quietly and without ceremony, for more people than could be counted. The article mentioned Raymond. Frank had asked Kara to include this, because Raymond was the reason and Raymond deserved to be the reason. It mentioned Nora and Angela and Marcus and Derek and Margie and James and Rosa, with their permission, because they were the proof, if proof was needed, that what happened at this counter was real. It did not mention the notebooks by name, but it mentioned that Frank kept records, that he held onto what people told him, that the accumulation of 27 years of conversation had produced something that no individual conversation could have produced alone. The response was, in the context of a regional magazine article, significant. People came in who had never been to the diner before. They came in cautiously, the way people came into places they had read about, expecting something different from what they found, and not sure whether to be disappointed or relieved when what they found was just a diner with good coffee and strong eggs, and a man behind the counter who asked your name, and seemed to actually want to know the answer. Frank made coffee and made eggs and wrote things in his notebook, and talked to people and tried, as he always tried, not to let what was happening become something he was performing rather than doing. One morning in October, Marcus came in before school. He had the pre-internship behind him and a conversation with David Park about what came next, which apparently involved an application to a university computer science program that David had connections at. He sat at the counter and Frank put coffee in front of him. Marcus drank coffee now. Frank had been right about that, and Marcus was quiet for a moment before he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Frank said. "The notebook thing," Marcus said. "The way you hold on to what people say, where did you learn that?" Frank thought about how to answer. "I didn't learn it anywhere," he said. "I just decided to do it." "Why?" Frank thought about Raymond. "Because there was someone I didn't listen to closely enough," he said. "And after that I thought about all the people I hadn't listened to closely enough. And I thought, the one thing I can actually control in this job, in this place, is whether I pay attention. So I decided to pay attention." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing." "That's the whole thing," Frank said. Marcus drank his coffee. "My grandmother says attention is love made practical," he said. Frank looked at him. "Your grandmother should write a book," he said. Marcus smiled. It was a complete smile, the smile of someone who had become, over the past year, slightly more willing to let things land. "She says you should come to dinner sometime," he said. "Tell her I'll come in November," Frank said. "I take Sundays off." The diner on Clearwater Avenue was still open the following spring. It was still open because Frank Delano was still behind the counter at 6 in the morning, every day except Sunday. It was still open because Nora came in every morning and ordered coffee and sometimes eggs, and occasionally brought a small succulent to add to the collection that now occupied the entire length of the windowsill behind the counter. It was still open because Derek came in at 7:15 with his delivery truck waiting outside and reported, in his economical way, that his daughter was doing well, was thinking about community college, had decided she wanted to study psychology. It was still open because Margie came in at 8 and ordered oatmeal and talked about her garden. It was still open because James Cooper came in on Fridays and was running a 3-person contracting business now and had just bought a house, which Frank had heard about from Gil Tours before James mentioned it himself. Because in a neighborhood Frank had been in for 29 years, information moved in many directions. It was still open because Frank had one new notebook, the 64th, 3/4 full, and had already started thinking about where he kept his supply of the 99-cent composition notebooks that cost nothing and held everything. Marcus sent a text one afternoon in May. It said, "I got in. Computer science. Full ride. I start in September." Frank read it during the slow hour between breakfast and lunch.